What if Napoleon won at Waterloo? On June 18, 1815, he lost, by a margin so thin, historians still argue about the exact moment it turned. But here's the twist most people miss. Even if he'd won, it might not have mattered. Wellington and Blucher's armies weren't the whole coalition. Roughly 700,000 more Austrian and Russian troops were already mobilizing and marching toward France, forces that barely fired a shot at Waterloo. Most historians agree, a French win here just delays the reckoning. It doesn't prevent it. So, play it out. Napoleon wins big, thanks in part to a stronger showing 2 days earlier at Ligny, and takes Brussels. Some historians think he could have pushed as far as the Rhine and the Scheldt. But he doesn't get to enjoy it. Word arrives, the real coalition army is closing in on Paris. He has to turn around and race home to defend the capital. And here's where the story most people imagine ends, actually keeps going. Within weeks, maybe a few months, he's beaten anyway. Not by Wellington, not by Blucher, by Austria and Russia. That single detail, who actually delivers the final blow, is bigger than it sounds. Because the empire that beats you gets to write the piece that follows. France, having risen twice now, doesn't get to just quietly restore the old king and move on. Some historians think this version of France doesn't have a clean succession at all, that it risks sliding into civil war, while the powers outside argue over who gets to decide its future. And while everyone's watching France collapse in on itself, Britain, less central to this fight than it was in our history, quietly ends up stronger anyway. Distracted empires lose colonies. Britain doesn't miss the opportunity. So no, winning at Waterloo doesn't save Napoleon's empire. Almost every historian agrees on that part. But it changes who beats him, how France falls apart, and who's sitting at the table when the real piece gets written. And that piece, not the battle, is what actually reshapes the next 100 years. That's part 2. Last time, Napoleon wins the battle, loses the war anyway. But this time, Austria and Russia deliver the final blow, not Britain. That one change rewrites everything that happens next. In our history, the peace terms were already set. The Congress of Vienna wrapped up just days before Waterloo. Napoleon's 100 days was him breaking that peace. So this time, the powers don't just tidy up an existing settlement. They have to write a second one, from a much angrier position. France rose twice. That changes the tone completely. Expect harsher terms than the real Second Treaty of Paris, deeper territorial losses, a larger war indemnity, a longer foreign occupation to make sure it doesn't happen a third time. And the succession question gets messy. Does Napoleon go into exile again, or somewhere more permanent this time? Does his young son, Napoleon II, get installed as a controlled figurehead? Or do external powers force the Bourbons back onto a throne nobody in France actually still wants? Some historians think this version of France is genuinely at risk of civil war, a fight not just over who rules, but over what France even is anymore, fought while foreign armies are still occupying half the country. Meanwhile, Austria walks away the biggest winner in Europe. They delivered the final blow. That buys them leverage over Prussia, over the German states, over how the rest of the continent gets carved up. And that leverage matters for one specific reason. A stronger, more paranoid Austria has every incentive to keep the German states fragmented, not unified. No single dominant Prussia. No clear path to a unified Germany the way it happened in our timeline decades later in 1871. Britain, meanwhile, isn't at that negotiating table fighting for territory in Europe. They're quietly cementing global dominance elsewhere, picking up French colonial holdings while the continent is consumed with itself. So 10 years out from Waterloo, around 1825, you've got a France still recovering from internal fracture, an Austria more powerful than it ever was in our history, a Germany kept deliberately fragmented, and a Britain even further ahead globally than it actually was. That's 10 years, but every one of those changes keeps compounding for the next 200. In Part 3, we go all the way to today and ask what 2026 looks like in a world where Germany never unified the way we know it. Fair warning, this is where history ends and speculation begins. Quick heads up before we go further. Parts 1 and 2 were built on real historian debate. This part isn't. This is the fun version, the biggest, wildest chain of consequences we can honestly justify, starting from one battle. Buckle up. Here's the big swing. Instead of staying fragmented, the German states kept weak and divided by Austria for decades eventually get absorbed. Not unified by Prussia, absorbed by France. By the 1870s, there's no Germany at all. There's just a much bigger France. Picture a Napoleonic dynasty, his descendants. Not him ruling a continental empire, stretching from the Atlantic to Poland. No Kaiser. No German Empire. Just 3 generations of Bonapartes running most of continental Europe. That forces the weirdest alliance in this timeline's history. Austria and Russia, former enemies, banding together out of pure fear of the French superstate next door. Britain joins them reluctantly, because of France, this big threatens everyone's colonies too. So you still get a world war, just decades earlier, and with completely different sides. Call it the Franco-Continental War France, and its absorbed territories against an Austro-Russo-British coalition, fought in the early 1900s instead of 1914. No Franz Ferdinand, no assassination in Sarajevo. Just an empire that finally got too big for everyone else to tolerate, and a war that ends, decades early, with France broken up for good this time, split into pieces by the winning coalition. And here's the twist. Breaking up the French superstate finally gives German nationalism the opening it never had. A unified Germany actually forms a century later than in our history, born out of the ashes of this war instead of causing one. Which means, in this version of 2026, Germany isn't Europe's old power. It's practically the new kid. No World War II, the way we know it, because the very country that caused it in our timeline doesn't even exist yet when it would have. One battle, a 300-year detour, and a Germany that shows up a century late to a party it never actually started. Completely different history. Same one big question. How much can really change before it just changes back? Let me know your version in the comments.